disciples before leaving them in a village just outside Jerusalem. The last Gospel, John, has many different stories that do not appear in any of the other Gospels. Having all these differing Gospel versions of the story is confusing.
None of the Gospel stories is CNN in Jerusalem in the year 30.
These aren't people who are standing at the foot of the crucifix with notebooks in their hand, writing it all down.
The Gospels are written in the form of historical biography, so many people have assumed that they are exactly that. But that's not actually what they are. They're written to demonstrate to people the importance and the meaning of Jesus and his teaching. That was what they're for, and they do that very well. But they're not primarily interested in what actually happened back there.
So one is forced into the apparently blasphemous position of doubting the historical truth of the Gospels.
If you start saying it's blasphemous to question gospel truth, which particular bits of the gospel are you choosing to say that about? Or are you saying all of them? And if you say it's all of them, there are endless bits that contradict each other. I mean, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John tell different accounts. I mean, some of them don't even tell about Christ being born in a stable. You know, which bits are true and which bits aren't true? If you look at the Easter narrative, the key narrative of the different gospels, they all tell different accounts. Some of them don't mention the Garden of Gethsemane. You know, what is gospel truth? There are 4 gospels, they all tell different truths. Surely people have to realise that it's much more complicated than that.
These complications have led many modern scholars to suggest that the gospel stories were not written to tell of a miraculous event, but that they were written with an entirely different and political motive.
Whether we like it or not, the function of the stories in the last chapters of the Gospel is not to establish Jesus has risen. Isn't that marvelous? Which surely would be enough to say. But Jesus has risen, of course. But to whom did Jesus speak? And whom did Jesus put in charge?
Insisting that Jesus literally rose from the grave and was seen by a few people who knew him after he died is a way of restricting the experience of resurrection to a very few people, and therefore maintaining the authority of the group within that group.
You have competing leadership accounts using apparitions or empty tombs to establish who's in charge here or who's in charge there. That's their function, that's their purpose.
So Peter is said to be the first witness of the resurrection. To this day, of course, for example, the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church claims to be the descendant of St. Peter, and authorized, you know, by an unbroken chain of ordination from Peter. That is, the resurrection is taken to be validation in many cases of the authority of the churches.
Some scholars go so far as to suggest that the story of the resurrection was created not only to give authority to the church, but also as an extraordinary psychological tool to bring in new converts.
If it hadn't been for the resurrection of Jesus and his rising from the dead, victorious from the dead, we wouldn't be celebrating Christmas.
It's a bit like when you go into the army. The first thing we want is to take over your body. So symbolically, let's say we're going to shave all your hair. As long as you give in on this, we got you. We got your body, which is what we want. In one sense, sometimes the churches, some churches at least, do the same. We're going to tell you something unbelievable that you got to believe. If you believe it, then you will believe that they alone control heaven, that without them you cannot get into heaven, and then they've got you. You've left your brains in the parking lot.
That's a statement that may be offensive to many Christians. It would certainly be offensive to the worshippers at the Toronto Airport Church, who take their belief in the literal truth of the resurrection of Jesus very seriously indeed.
Well, I hear this singing in the streets, now Jesus is alive. All creation shouts aloud that Jesus is alive.
For these Christians, the risen Christ is an active part of the church, and they believe that in 1994, Jesus blessed their church with a miraculous healing mission.
In the spirit for 1 minute.
Since then, thousands of churches around the world have claimed to be touched by what has become known as the Toronto blessing.
1 minute. Bless you, man. Oh, blessed Okay, blessing means everything that God has to give.
The fastest growing and most active parts of the Christian church in the 21st century seem to be those which, despite all the contradictions and anomalies, fervently promote the literal truth of the gospel stories of Jesus' life, his death, and his resurrection.
Blessed!
And in Toronto, in a splendid new church built by contributions from the faithful, the congregation continued to celebrate their belief in the resurrected Christ.
Well, be blessed.
Here, on an almost weekly basis, they claim that their faith has the power, miraculously, to heal.
So God's going to heal you right now? There it goes, and the neck is healed in Jesus' name. Don't you like it? I like it. Bless you, brother.
Today, it seems to me that there are many people who will strongly defend the literal truth of the resurrection. Many others believe that perhaps, those who die may be alive in some way, that Jesus who died might be in some sense alive, whatever one means by that. And there are many others who take it as an image of hope, because after all, talking about the resurrection of Jesus has a great deal to do with what we think about life after death, or for that matter, our own prospects.
But the problem for the church in the 21st century, in a technological and secular age, is that people find it harder and harder to believe in the literal truth of any of the miracles, let alone the miracle of the resurrection.
Since the 18th century, we've lived in a climate where people have distinguished between faith and belief. So the whole effect of science on religion really has been to throw religion back, to prove what we can believe in.
But week in and week out, congregations gather in Christian churches and recite together an ancient creed. From the Latin word credo, meaning I believe.
We believe in one God, the Father, the Almighty.
We believe in one God, the Father, the Almighty.
For our sake.
At the climax of the creed, all Christians affirm their belief in the resurrection.
He suffered death and was buried. On the third day he rose again.
In accordance with the Scriptures.
He ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of the Father.
He will come again in glory to judge the living and the dead.
But whatever is said in church, many modern Christian theologians no longer consider the resurrection to be an historical fact.
We believe.
And it's not just a 21st century problem that there are differences between what the church wants us to believe and what people actually do believe.
We look for the resurrection of the dead.
1,000 years ago, a group of devout Christians also held unorthodox views.
There have certainly down the ages been people within the bosom of Christianity who have had problems with the whole idea of resurrection and Christ's death and resurrection. If you look at the Cathars believed that the world was the creation of the devil, that it was irredeemably evil, everything about it was bad. So therefore they had great difficulty with believing the idea that Jesus would come here as a man anyway. Why would he want to come to this terrible place? But what they certainly had a problem with, why on earth would he be resurrected? Why would he want to come back to this earth? The church was so appalled by what it saw as this terrible blasphemy about the resurrection that they created the Inquisition. Off it went to the Cathars to the south of France, and it gouged out their eyes, it stretched them on racks, it burnt villages, it cut limbs off, and simply because it couldn't bear to hear people questioning these unquestionable truths as far as it was concerned.
In 1244, the last 200 of the Cathars were rounded up and burned at the stake as heretics. The Inquisition went on to spend 300 years suppressing anyone who questioned either the concept of gospel truth or the historical accuracy of the resurrection. But there is one story, also set in France at about the same time as the Cathars, which tells of another Christian group who made a discovery which really did suggest that the resurrection story was not true. And what they did was to hide the evidence. In the 13th century, this whole area was a stronghold of the Knights Templar, a strict military and religious order of warrior monks. Local historian Thierry Lecomte has spent the last 12 years uncovering the history of the Knights Templar in this region.
Les Templiers, ils seraient venus dans la région parce qu'il y a des traces notamment campagne, et en revenant par ici, du côté de Serres, on a des traces. En bas derrière, en bas du château de Blanchefort, il y a des ruines de Favy, qui serait une ancienne commanderie templière.
The Knights Templar were committed to poverty, chastity, and the protection of pilgrims en route to the Holy Land. But their main purpose was to keep Jerusalem and the holy sites of Christianity free from the forces of Islam. While they were in the Holy Land, the Templars built their own castles, but they buried their dead in graves they excavated near to the original Temple of Solomon. And certainly during this time, they were thought to have discovered great treasures. Eventually the Templars were forced to leave the Holy Land in 1186. They returned to France. Certainly the Templars remained powerful, rich, and incredibly secretive. So it's not surprising that people speculated about them, and there grew a legend that the Knights Templar had discovered Jesus' bones in Jerusalem, that they had brought them back to France and buried them somewhere near here. In the last 200 years, the search has focused on a small church in the village of Rennes-le-Château. Modern scholars like Richard Andrews are convinced that there are clues here that might reveal what exactly the Templars did find during their excavations in Jerusalem.
One can ask the question, did the Templars find relics, an ossuary full of bones, that they thought were possibly the bones of Jesus? Now, if they had found these, it would have been a shock to the system, because the Templars were good Christians. This would challenge the whole doctrine of resurrection, because here are mortal remains. So we ask the second question, why should the Templars risk being accused of heresy and bringing the bones that they thought were Jesus's back to this area? The answer is simple. If they had found something which they believed were the bones of Christ, they needed a safe location. You could hide a church in these mountains, let alone a small ossuary. You can get lost in these mountains today. Imagine what it was like 1,000 years ago.
In the late 19th century, a local priest called Berenger Saunier claimed to have found ancient documents, and whatever they were, he certainly became very rich afterwards. Richard Andrews has found clues among these parchments, using elaborate geometry and transferring symbols from ancient paintings onto equally ancient maps, all in the hope of finding a Templar treasure trove.
The clues that we found point to a map in the form of a hexagram, which is also known as the Seal of Solomon, but it is the Star of David. This map points to a specific site. Now we know that the priest, Berenger Saunier, became fabulously wealthy, but we are sure that he didn't actually find what he was looking for. We can deduce, perhaps, that Saunier received money from patrons to look for a location in the area that might reveal perhaps the bones of Christ. Whatever it is, we do know one thing for sure. The secret that Saunier was giving clues to was heretical.
Saunier died in 1917 and took his secret with him to the grave. But that hasn't stopped enthusiasts like Thierry Lecomte from continuing to search on the basis of Richard's work and trying to solve the mystery. Using a local map on which the geometric lines have been transposed, Thierry has found further evidence of the Templars' existence, and he believes that he may be closing in on the location where the Templars could have buried the bones of Jesus.
Là, vous avez le sommet du Cardou, là, où il y a deux cèdres. Ils sont espacés tous les deux, à peu près, il y a une